All right, thank you, and thanks for the invitation. As Rob said, my background is forest mensuration, forest inventory, statistics, but it always has to be in the context of the management and what you want to do with all those numbers and things. So this is one of the ones that I worked with in particular, is the urban forest. So I thought I'd just give you a bit of a story about Canberra and how it came to be the city that it is. So for the overseas people who might not know where we are, this is Canberra, the ACT, Australian Capital Territory. We're a little island cut out of New South Wales. There's a section that is designed to be the urban. Oh, yes, the pointer on the screen. That's interesting. There we go. So there's a section that is the urban, and then the rest is parks and reserves and a bit of farmland and what have you. So where we're talking about the beginning of Canberra, we're talking about the Walter and Marion Griffin, who won the wonderful award to design the city. Most Canberrans are very proud of Walter and Marion because it was quite an international competition. We're very proud of the fact that they designed the city. The city's designed. Most visitors can't believe it's designed, except it's designed as a maze because it's more confusing. But it was designed, and once you know it, it's a lovely design. Part of that design included a lot of tree plantings in a lot of parks and in a lot of gardens, but the Griffins themselves weren't botanists, they weren't foresters, they weren't even particularly gardeners. So when they designed it with big sways of their arm. They make all that red trees over there and make that exciting trees over there. And they did have some ideas. They wanted the major avenues to be eucalypts because they're native trees, so make them native. And the actual cities, suburbs and what have you, make them exotics, because we know about exotics. We had our experience from North America, planting exotics in cities. Along came Charles Weston. He was basically the first forester, and he set about designing what he was calling a garden city. But it was based on trees. Weston planted lots. It was a young city. They had designs for lots of important buildings to go in eventually, but for the first couple of decades, there's nothing but vacant blocks, which is very depressing to look at. So he planted them. So there's huge blocks of trees planted in quite heavy loads, which most non-foresters don't understand why you would plant 1,000 trees when you know only a couple of hundred will survive at the end. He was followed by Lindsay Pryor. And Lindsay was very definitely a researcher. He ended up being the first professor of botany at the Australian National University. But he was interesting because he realised that Australians didn't know what trees would work well in an Australian city. So he experimented. Basically, he used the entire city as an experiment, a massive arboretum. So between Weston and Pryor, we experimented a lot. They tried different things. You'll find little arboreta. You used to find arboreta all throughout Canberra until the big fires in the 2000s burnt them all down. So a couple survived. This is one of the survivors that's left. It's now called Pryor's Arboretum. So it's an experimentation just to see how these trees would work in the climate of Canberra. It's not a very nice climate for trees. It's too dry in summer and too cold in winter. It's classified as half as wet and twice as cold as Sydney. But they also set up the Australian National Botanic Gardens, which is only looking at natural species in Australia in this area. So it's a very large national garden, but only of exotics, only of indigenous species. So through the time, Canberra evolved. So the city was established back in the early 1900s, and we tried different things. So this is just a little example. Back in the 1920s, there's a dozen eucalypt species they tried, But most of the species they planted around Canberra were exotic. So we had over about 60 different exotics they planted. Didn't know how they were going, but they planted a whole street up to it. So how's this going to go? Oh, it didn't work. I will plant some more up. And that continued for the next couple of decades. A few, a dozen or so eucalypts, and then the vast majority of the exotics. And then something happened in the 1960s. The 1960s, Australians suddenly became very proud of our country, and we decided, why are we planting all these exotics? And we doubled the species that we were planting of the native species. So let's give it a go. And since then, the number of native species has been relatively high. In the 80s, 36, 3 dozen different exotic species were planted across the city. So didn't know how they were going? Oh, we'll plant them and see how it goes. So we've got a much more balanced set of species across the estate now, but there's over 100 different species in the city. Some, there's only a few remnants. Some we decided, no, that's an absolute failure, we're not doing that anymore. And some actually work. But the city itself has got quite a diverse population of species in the city. So we're actually really quite highly diverse. Although the design of the city is the streets tend to only have one species. So the entire street is planted up at once to one species, often where the seed came from one location, and sometimes they're clones. So the entire street is basically just clones of the same species. And so those little trees, we planted them and they grow. Everyone knows trees grow. It's a wonderful thing that they do. And they've grown so well, basically the trees dominate the city. So you might think, and originally Canberra was talked about as being the garden city, but now we do call it the bush city, bush capital, because there's so many eucalypts, or the tree city. So we have estates like this. This was one of the original sort of ideas for a park. This is the park that's surrounding Lake Burley Griffin, and it's now full of these mature eucalypt trees, nice big open plantings. Of course, we know how well eucalypts go in grassland situations. We also have streets full of eucalypts. This is somewhat rarer. We used to only do this on the major arterial routes. So if you come into Canberra on Northbourne Avenue or something, the original plan was to have all these wonderful big exotics, big eucalypts there. One of the things you did on the arterial routes because you didn't expect pedestrians. So if a tree fell on you, it's unlikely to fall on a pedestrian. Now we've got so many more streets with these things, and there is a little concern sometimes that the ukes shed branches. But this was more the expected streetscape in the suburbs, these wonderful exotics, often with colourful autumn leaves. And Canberra's actually a little bit famous now for having very nice autumnal colours, which is quite rare in Australia because our indigenous species tend not to do that. We have modelled the growth of these things, so we've got reasonable ideas of how quickly they grow. We estimate, this is an example for, that's terribly bad of me, no sign on that one. This is one of the eucalypt species. You can see it takes them a little while to settle in, and then they power along, growing height for a while, and the canopy lifts up. We tend to prune them all, so there's at least 2 to 3 metres of bare stem at the bottom of the tree, so you don't poke your eye out when you walk past. So we've got a whole bunch of these models to tell how things are going. And these trees, when they're mature, are providing huge amounts of various ecological and environmental values for us. There's been estimates, by myself admittedly, that we're getting up to $15 million per annum, probably now close to $20 or $25 million per annum in stormwater mitigation, heat island cooling effects, property value improvements, all those sorts of things. They've all been, we priced them largely based on the size of these canopies. So a big healthy canopy does collect the water, does slow down the stormwater, does cool the city. Big bold trees do store carbon. There's a whole bunch of other unpriced values these things provide. These ones in particular provide lots of biodiversity value, animals, beasts of all sorts of types use these ones, but they do also use the exotics. So when people say, oh, exotics are no good for Australian animals, don't you believe it? Birds and things will love these things as much as these things. They'll work out how to live in. So there's something like $20 million per year of benefits provided by these trees as they grow. And of course, can't be in Bunyan's group without talking a little bit about carbon. They grow carbon too. This is a study that we did back in 2008. We used the old full cam model, put grids across the entire territory and looked at what the standing carbon was. So here's the urban environment. So there's the urban environment. You can see there's not much carbon in the forests of the urban environment. And here's the national parks and reserves. So quite a bit more carbon standing up in these things. Unfortunately, a lot of this was burnt in 2008. And this is the sequestration between 2008 and 2015. So how are these forests growing? So when we're talking about all the Kyoto protocols and all that sorts of stuff, we're interested in sequestration, not stock. And now it's a very, very different picture. The native forests, well, some of them are still recovering from the fire. And in fact, we're not sequestering carbon in this period. We're actually losing. We're losing on average something like a tonne of carbon per year per hectare over the native forests. So they're not doing too well. The recent rains over the last couple of years, this has probably kicked right up, but I don't have current data on that. This is the interesting thing here. Here's the urban forest. It's powering along. So in terms of sequestration, this patch of urban forest is actually putting on more carbon than all this native forest. So the split in sequestration is something like 49%, 50% of sequestration over that time. So it's an unusual story that even though the urban estates, only a few percent of the ACT, it's sequestering most of the carbon. So we can, it's to do with age class distribution. These are young trees actively growing, and these are old ones responding to damage. So it's just one of those interesting stories. As trees grow, this story will change with time. And that's really the big story I want to talk about. Trees grow, you planted them, and they grow, and they grow, and they grow until, and we get to this until, and then you start to see these signs sticking around in place. And you start to see these signs, and you start to see people saying things like this. Trees don't die. What are you doing? They don't die, but they can be killed. Well, we know they can be killed because all the fire killed them. That's natural. That's all right. But when you come and do this, that's a tree, and you're going to chop it down. What's going on? And people complain. They complain, how dare you do that? Lindsay Pryor didn't say he was killing trees. He said they were thinning them. This is a perfectly reasonable term for foresters or for farmers. You're thinning things out. But this is a complaint in the 1940s. Why would you plant them all in the first place and then root them all out and spend money? And then we have letters to the editor, wanton destruction, and citizens of Canberra should rise up in their wrath, what have you. We could write this letter again today, but of course, today very few people read the Canberra Times, and probably no one understands what the word wrath means. But apart from that, I also look at this one as interesting. Canberra will look as it did. And I'm wondering what they think it did look like. Are you talking about just before Canberra, when the farmers had come through and cleared the few trees that were here, or when the Aboriginals were looking after it? Because there is now evidence that they did a lot of manipulation of the environment with fire and with farming and what have you. So what did it look like? It was probably a few scattered trees. We've certainly got more trees now in Canberra than we ever had. So what is going on there? We'd have to cut down an awful lot of trees, to get it back looking like it did. But we do take trees out for a range of reasons. This is the northern part of Canberra. This, for anyone familiar, is Hague Park. This was a massive planting right across the northern entrance to the city. So down to the south here is the city proper. This is where the original Burley Griffin plan ended. So this was the northern end of the city, and this was the Northbourne Avenue. This was the grand entrance to the city with this big tree-lined avenue. So all this stuff up here, which is now, we're about 90% of the city is now expanded beyond what the original plans were. This was not conceived of being farmland, but we grew it. So this is how we were growing. This is an urban development in here, and you can see just from the colour, there's an awful lot of trees in here. You can still see the plantings along the streets, very green, and all the backyards had a tree. The Great Australian Dream, quarter-acre block, little house, Hills Hoist clothesline, and a tree in the backyard with swing on it. This was the Australian Dream. This is what this looked like. This is the suburb of Turner. This is what we look like now. That's densification. So we're taking these little quarter-acre blocks and building apartment towers on them. Or car parks, very exciting things, car parks. And you can see the amount of trees in here is dramatically reduced. We still have street trees, and we still have Hague Park, but you can see now in Hague Park as well, there's big gaps in Hague Park. These trees, some are 100 years old, because it's one of the early plantings, and it's starting to collapse. But we're talking about dead. What's dead? Is that tree dead? Well, you can see dead bits in it. It's the big dead branches, the dead stuff in here. So it's not technically dead. It's a eucalypt. Eucalypts always have dead wood in their crowns. Once they hit maturity, there's always something dead up there. That's actually really important. If you're a beastie, a arboreal mammal or a bird, often you rely on these dead things for your habitat. So there's some dead crown, but it's still not a dead tree. That's all right, isn't it? What about this one? Is this one dead? Looks pretty dead, but you can see this really fine figure. This is the Epicomic development. So this tree is trying to come back, and it might survive. In fact, I went back this to it didn't, but it was trying. If it got the right conditions, maybe a bit more water, it might survive. But it's not at this stage technically dead. Right, this one's dead. Okay. These leaves are from another tree, so don't get confused. It's dead. It's not only dead, it's been made safe as a dead tree. So they've actually had arborists come through and say, oh, this branch is still structurally sound, there's no rot in it, but the little branches coming off it are possibly a problem, so they've cut them off. They've left hollows, and they've left perching points for particularly for birds. So that one is definitely dead. So in the city, how many trees are you happy to have like that? How many are you happy to have like that? And how many are you happy to have like that? Now, the thing is, in a city, trees are there for a purpose. Now, one of the big purposes of trees in our city is beautification. Is that beautiful? Maybe. How about that one? Probably not. That one? Oh, some people love them. How many of these should you have in your street? In a natural forest in Australia, the number of dead standing trees is probably somewhere between 40 and maybe 400, depending on the circumstances. Do you need that many in the city? Do you need that many of that sort of tree? That's a question we have to ask. That's a single dead tree. Now remember the way Canberra was developed was street plantings of the same species, possibly exactly the same individual with their clones at the same age. So here's a mature street of eucalypts. This is not atypical. This is in, where are we? That's one of the inner cities. And here it is just down the road. So these ones are all looking pretty much like that second tree in the previous example. This is a different species actually planted by the landowner. But the entire streetscape now is dying. And this is what's going to happen in Canberra. You know, if you've got one tree dying in the street because of environmental conditions, the chances are the rest are going to go as well. So what are we going to do with that? Well, the first thing we want to do is find out how bad this was. So back in the early 2000s, we conducted fairly major surveys and worked out how these trees are going. No one had been actually recording deaths of trees. We had a really big arboricultural department in Canberra before we got self-government. And they just were there all the time, cleaning all the time, but they didn't keep records because each arborist had a suburb. You didn't need records because you give your suburb. So it took us a little while to work what was going on. So all we had is we just knew what percentage of these trees were being worked on. So here's a simple empirical graph. What's the probability of a tree remaining healthy for another year? Healthy being not requiring maintenance, not requiring that it would be cut out of the top or anything like that. So our shorter trees, pretty good. They've got a 90+ chance of being healthy for another year. Once they get to around 20 metres, we've got a 50-50 chance you're going to have to work on this tree. Now in the eucalypts, this is actually a eucalypt graph. This point here of where there's a 50-50 chance you're going to have dead crown material, that happens when the trees are about 20 metres, and that happens when the trees are about 50 years old in Canberra. They don't grow real fast. And once you get to that point, every year after that, the chances are you're going to have to do something. So what does the city look like? Well, our green earth structure is proportional to the canopy volume. That's what we get it for. And big trees cost to maintain. I'm always intrigued with Auckland City Council over in New Zealand. Had a big, if they like urban forests, they think it's very, very important. But they told me when I was there a couple of decades ago that they were getting, again, much more proud of their city. So they were planting indigenous species now, shrubs. New Zealand's famous for shrubs. It's got some wonderful shrubs. That's what they're planting. Indigenous, proud. Well, the thing is, shrubs are really easy to maintain. You whack it in the ground, and 10 years later, when they look a bit scrubby, you pull them out, pull a new one in. It's really, really simple. But your benefit is canopy area. And shrubs do not have the canopy area of trees by 2 orders of magnitude, 100 times. So you plant shrubs, you get a little bit of benefit, but they're cheap. You plant trees, you get a lot of benefit, but when they get up to this point, they're expensive. So what's the balance? Cheap, low value, or expensive, high value? It also brings us to this point of, trees do grow. You put them in the ground, they're going to grow. There's no doubt about it, but they're mortal. And then we can talk about these ideas. The biological life, everyone tells me trees live for centuries. It's possible. Not all trees. The average life of a eucalypt is about 10, simply because so many die in the first year, and then some will live for centuries. We have useful lives. This is still doing what it's supposed to be doing, and we have safe lives. I would be walking under that tree, it would kill me. So we did some studies. This was this big one we called Dismount. It stands for Decision Information System for Managing Urban Trees, and I had a fleet of university students actually visited every tree in the city and made a judgment of how healthy it was, what species it was, how tall it was, and we had this wonderful record. That took us a few years around the turn of the century. My students loved the project, although they ended up calling this, they called it that dog rather than people. And it was looking good. This is kind of some of the stuff we came out of that survey. Sorry if it doesn't turn out too well. This is the number of the trees in the city, and this is when they were planted. So we did our study in 2000. So in 2000, we had a couple of thousand trees planted that year. If you can tell by the colour coding, we are talking about evergreens, broadleaf exotics, eucalypts. We've got deciduous exotics, and then there's conifers down here. And the background is just a 5-year average to smooth this whole curve out. So you can see we've got this big planting mass that was done in the 60s and 70s, where most of. But we've got some which were planted in the original. So these are planted up pre-1925. So they're a century old now. Some of our oldest trees are a century, still going. You can see there's gaps in the system where Canberra didn't grow, no one planted any, or they planted them and they were failures, we ripped them all out again. But so you see we have this very uneven distribution of ages with some real big peaks in here. One interesting big peaks in here is these were planted in 1975, 1960s in there, and mostly eucalypts. And I did say after eucalypts reach about 50 years old, you've got a 1 in 2 chance they're going to need major work. So we've got this huge thing coming towards us. When we did the study, it didn't look too bad. This is the health conditions of the city. So half the trees powering along, no problems whatsoever. Yeah, almost half. The assessor said it could be a problem. We've got what we call very high angle forks in the branches. So I'm sure you can see, but a high angle fork means that you've got the branches like that, and if you get bark in that branch, water comes in here, enters right, and then you have this possibility of breaking off. So we were worried about that. And there's about a quarter of the trees have some external evidence of a problem. Already a branch dead, maybe several branches dead, dieback in the minor ones, Epicomics come back, say it's got stress and it's fighting back some other defects. All the trees are actually dead. So about 1% of our estate was dead. But dead and either we hadn't picked up yet or dead and made safe. So back in the 20s, we did another survey in the middle of the period, which happened to be the middle of the millennium drought. We had all our models to predict how these forests were growing. The models actually did really well. We were predicting height and canopy cover. They weren't growing quite as tall as we thought, quite as fast. The canopies weren't quite as much as we thought they should grow. And there are a few more dead trees than we expected. But overall, our models we made back here were plus or minus about 3 to 5%. We were really happy with that. We thought, oh, that'll give us a really good thing. We'll go on forever. We'll do that forever and ever and ever. And then, of course, straight after that, the ACT government changed its whole mind and dismantled Dismount, didn't ignore it anymore. And they tried what they call this rapid audit system, where they've got professionals in to estimate the useful life expectancy of the trees. So they did a sample, they ran to different suburbs, different streets, and they sampled and they put the trees into categories. I reckon you live for the next 5 years, next 10 years, 10 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 40. And again, they were saying the state's pretty good in that about 45% of the estate would grow for 40 years and present the useful life. They were doing what they were supposed to be doing. About a third were in the 10 to 20, and the rest were shorter than that. And then the drought broke, and we were happy, and they did the audit again, and they were really happy. The trees looked healthier, but in fact, more trees dropped out of that 40 plus than were expected, and more dropped out of the 10 to 20 expected. They dropped right down to less than 10. So they had this flash of growth, but the arborists were saying, you've got problems. These trees are not happy. They're not as happy as they look. Something's going on. And then, of course, we started having things like the climate change review and the heat mapping, and we started to realise that Canberra's getting hotter, drier, nastier. So something's happened with our trees. We're going to have to be worried about these trees. The trees we've got planted, some won't be happy. We're going to change our minds. So that's where Canberra is. We started with a great legacy. The Weston, the Griffins plan, but actually as put in by Weston and Lindsay, was wonderful. The whole city is an arboretum. We have ideas now that we never knew about, new things that we didn't know. But the trees are growing and the clock is ticking. So these trees are getting old and things are going to have to change. The environment's changing. What we're doing is changing. The city itself is going to have to make some ideas. What are we doing with this stuff? How much do you spend keeping the big old trees going? How much do you spend keeping street trees, streets full of big old trees going? Well, what are you going to do? What are you going to replace them? If they were good last year, do you replace them again? The city's getting drier. What are we going to do? And as soon as you start mentioning trees to the residents of Canberra, they are passionate. They're passionate for them, they're passionate against them. They're passionate for some species, they're passionate against the species. The easiest thing to do is to go to one of the eucalypt species suburbs, plant eucalypts, and ask the residents, do you like eucalypts? And half will say, yes, they're wonderful. Don't give me those rotten, deciduous, exotic trees. They drop leaves everywhere, they're messy. And the other half of the street will say, no, they're terrible. They're so messy, they drop bark everywhere. It's terrible. And someone's going to plant it. And unfortunately, if you plant the wrong thing and people don't like it, they accidentally drive their car over the tree you planted in the street. So we have to work out what we're doing with that. And we have to bring the people along. But whatever happens, it's going to cost us. Big trees cost a lot to maintain, and we might have lots of dead trees in the streets. We don't need that many. And the worst thing to do with a tree is chop it down and chip it. So one of my other little projects is trying to get people to work out what to do with them and how to use them. I want a little sustainable forest industry back in Canberra using some of these wonderful trees, wonderful histories. But have that just chop them down and chip them, which is what's happening. Or buried. They chop them down and bury them naturally. That's the life of death of trees in Canberra. This is pre-Canberra. This is about 20 years later. You can see what people do is they plant trees. And then we invent colour and we plant more trees. So that's what Canberra looked like about, it's probably 20 years ago now. And it's there. We've got this wonderful diversity. You can see these are eucalypt crowns, these are exotic crowns, and there's a few conifers over there. We still have some farmland out here somewhere, and there's Lake Burlington over here. It's full of trees. It's a tree city, but they're getting older. We've got work to do.